This week we are in part 2 of a series. It's simply called For. And throughout this series, we've been addressing the fact that for far too long, the Christian community has been known for what we are against rather than being known for what we're for. And so last week, we kind of started the series with what was a pretty convincing, but also honestly, a pretty convicting quote. The quote came from a book called Unchristian. It was written by a couple of guys named David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons. And what they did in preparation for this book is they actually did research where they talked with thousands and thousands of people who are not Christians, and they asked them, tell me what you think about people who are Christians. And in the book, they report this finding. It's a little convicting. It says, one crucial insight kept popping up in our exploration. In studying thousands of outsiders' impressions, it is clear that Christians are primarily perceived for what they stand against. We have become famous for what we oppose rather than who we are for. Outsiders believe Christians do not like them because of what they do, how they look, or what they believe. They feel minimized or worse, demonized by those who love Jesus. Now, whether you think that's a fair accusation or an unfair accusation is not really the point. That is the way people who are not Christian perceive the Christian community. And as we all know, perception is reality. That's right. Fill in the blank there for me. Yes, perception is reality. And so there's this reality that exists in our world, and we need to address it. And the problem with the reality that is seen in our world is that when you look at the life of Jesus, you see that Jesus, the man that we love, the man that we worship, the man that we follow by faith, he was a man who was truly for people. He wasn't against people. To the point that people who were nothing like Jesus wanted to spend time and be with Jesus. Now that's weird. I mean, just think about the people in your life, the people who want to spend time with you. They are probably a lot like you. Similar stage of life, same race, same income levels, probably even the same core values. But when you look at the life of Jesus, the people who were nothing like Jesus really wanted to be with Jesus. And so let me give you some examples. Jesus spent time with women in a day and a time when other Jewish rabbis, they would not even look at women, much less spend time with them. And yet there Jesus is. Not just spending time with women and treating women well and inviting women to be in relationship with him. But Jesus is a guy who was with women because he was for women. Jesus actually elevated the social status of women in his day in a way that no Jewish rabbi had ever done before. And it's why some of you young guys are like, yes, that's why I want to be like Jesus, because Jesus was for women and I'm for women, right? That's the way I would have felt when I was 17 or 18 years old. Jesus didn't just spend time with women, though. Jesus spent time with people of all races. So Jesus, being a Jewish rabbi in his day, primarily would have probably spent time only with Jewish people. In fact, other Jewish rabbis in his day, they saw the Gentiles as unclean. That's literally how they spoke about them. Samaritans were not just unclean. I even cringe to say this. They called Samaritans half-breeds. So they didn't want anything to do with them. And yet Jesus rolls onto the scene, and Jesus is going into Gentile territories. He spends some time with Gentile people. He uses the Good Samaritan story as this really convicting example of how we should be more like the Good Samaritan, like there's real value in those people. Jesus sat down with a woman at the well. It was a Samaritan woman. Jesus spent time with people who were nothing like him because he was for them. Jesus spent time with children in a day and a time when children were to be seen and not heard. And all the disciples would run the children away and say, come on, the master is too busy for kids like you. The scriptures tell us that Jesus actually became indignant. He was ticked off at his disciples because they were trying to get rid of the children. And Jesus said, no, bring the children to me because I am very much for children. Jesus spent time with orphans and widows. Jesus was for the sick, the lame, and the blind. Jesus was for people who had some very questionable character. Okay, so you can read the stories of like Matthew and Zacchaeus, okay? Matthew was a tax collector, became one of Jesus' closest followers. This guy named Zacchaeus was actually a chief tax collector. So like he was in charge of all the dirty scoundrels that were tax collectors. And so what these guys would do is they would overcharge common people in their taxes so that they could put a little extra jingle in their own pocket. And so they were constantly ripping people off, had no ethics, had no character, and these people who were nothing like Jesus actually wanted to spend time. They were fighting to be with Jesus. Why? Because they knew that Jesus was for them. Just go back to John chapter 3, verse 17. They knew that Jesus did not come into the world to condemn them, but to help them and to save them because he was for them. Now, I need you to know something about this. This isn't just about Jesus. This is about the way in which we live our lives as well. And when people feel like you are against them, they will want nothing to do with you. In fact, they will run away from you. They don't want to be criticized by you. They don't want to feel judged by you. And so when I go back to that David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons quote, and I think about what they said in that book, I don't look at that quote and think, well, that's not fair or that's not true. I don't get defensive. I look at that quote and I think to myself, well, why do they feel that way? What is it about people who are outside the Christian community? What is it that we are doing that makes them feel minimized or even worse, demonized? What am I doing as a Christian man that makes those outside the Christian community feel like, well, if you don't look like me, and if you don't think like me, and if you don't act like me, then I'm against you. I'm not really for you. What's driving that? Is it that they feel a little convicted when they're in the presence of the Christian community? Or is it that we come across as really condemning because we're people in the Christian community? Thankfully, David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons actually asked the question, and this is what they found. They said this: the primary reason that outsiders feel hostile toward Christians, and especially conservative Christians, is not because of any specific theological perspective. Listen, it has nothing to do with what we believe. It has everything to do with how we behave. Listen to what they say next. What they react negatively to is our swagger and how we go about things and the sense of self-importance that we project. Then it gets really interesting. They said outsiders say that Christians possess bark and bite. Christians may not normally operate in attack mode, but it happens frequently enough that others have learned to watch their step around us. We may not like it, but it's absolutely true. There is a major difference between being assertive about what we believe and being aggressive about what we believe. And when we become aggressive about what we believe, we slip into that attack mode that they're talking about, and people outside the Christian community start to back up. People outside the Christian community learn real fast that they better watch their step when they're around Christians because they do not like the bark and they do not want the bite. And so they learn that they need to be really, really careful. And we need to know this. We need to know that when people feel like we are against them, they will run from you. But I also want you to know that when people feel like you are for them, they will be drawn to you in the same way that they were drawn to Jesus. Remember, why is it that people who wanted nothing to do with Jesus or people who were nothing like Jesus actually wanted to spend all kinds of time with Jesus? Because they knew that Jesus was actually for them. Now, no one knew this better than the Apostle Paul. So right now we're studying the book of 1 Thessalonians. Paul is the guy who wrote this book. And the Apostle Paul was a guy, as he's writing chapter 2, he's trying to remind them, I was very much for you in the way that I treated you. But listen to me, that was not natural for Paul. If you think about that man's life and you read about him in the book of Acts, you'll remember that he was not always Paul. Before his name was changed, he was known as Saul. And Saul was not a guy who was for people. Saul was against people, to the point that he would spend most of his days walking through town, hunting down Christians in an attempt to kill them or persecute them. And then Saul met Jesus, and it didn't just change his name to Paul, it changed everything about him. It radically changed his life. And he went from being a guy who was against people to being a man who was very much for people. And so Paul is writing about how he was for those in the city of Thessalonica. This is what he said, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. We're only in 2 verses today. The text reads like this. Instead, he says, we were like young children among you. So Paul's right there. So remember with me, if you weren't here last week, we talked about that portion of the verse. And what we saw last week is that there is a big difference between big children and little children. Do you remember this? Big children, when they say, I love you, it's probably because they want something from you. If you've got a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old, you know all about that, right? But when little children say, I love you, it's not because they want something from you. It's because they genuinely love you. They mean that. And so Paul is using this analogy. I was like a little child among you, not a big child. I genuinely loved you and I was for you. But then Paul changes the analogy. He goes from saying I was like a little child to saying I was for you in another way. I was for you like a mother is for her children. Now listen to how he describes it in the rest of these 2 verses. He says, just as a nursing mother cares for her young children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of our God, but our very lives as well. Now, before I explain that passage, let me say this. At this point in the series, we're about halfway through the series, okay? It's just a 3-part series, so we're halfway through the second message. And right now, we've got 2 groups of people who are listening to this message, okay? We're going to call them Camp 1, and we're going to call them Camp 2. You need to figure out which camp you are in. So everybody in Camp 1 would be those people who are listening to this message, and you're going, yes! Finally, this guy is telling these Christian people like what they need to hear. This one is long overdue. We probably should have been doing this series 20 or 30 years ago, because for far too long the Christian community has been known for what we're against, and they need to know like that needs to change. And so some of you who feel that way, you may even think like you need to preach this series every single year until the day you die, okay? You are in Camp 1, okay? It doesn't matter if you're a Christian and you feel that way, or if you're a non-Christian and you feel that way. Everybody who feels that way, Camp 1. But then there's Camp 2. Because there's another group of people who are listening to this message, and they get a little uneasy in a series like this, because what they're trying to figure out is, well, what do you really mean when you say we need to be for people? Like, what's that look like? What does it mean to be for people? Do you think, Brandon, we just need to affirm everybody and approve of everybody and applaud everybody regardless of who they are or how they live their lives? Like in my marriage, you told me last week that I'm supposed to be for my spouse. What's that look like? So if my spouse is doing something that is hurting me and destroying our family, am I just supposed to be for them and just go, man, I just want you to know I am for you. I approve of you. I love you. Just know that before you go out there and wreck our family again this weekend. Is that what that looks like? When you say I'm supposed to be for my kids Do I just let my kids do whatever they want to do and become whoever they want to become? And all I do is sit back and just assure them, I approve of you, I'm for you, I love you. And some of you feel like this is a very slippery slope in terms of the way this gets applied. If that's the way you feel, then you are in what we're going to call Camp 2, okay? Let me say this. If you are listening to this and you are in Camp 2, then you need to know that next week the Apostle Paul is going to change the analogy one more time. He's going to go next week from being like a mother who cares for the children by caring for the children. So he's for the kids. He's for those in Thessalonica by caring for those in Thessalonica. And he's going to go from being a mother to being like a father. And next week, he's going to go from just saying, I was for you by caring for you, to saying, I was like a father who was for you by correcting you. Okay? So if you're in Camp 1 and you're just loving this series and this needs to be taught every single year, then you need to know this. Next week is the most important week of the series for you. But if you are in Camp 2, and you're going, I don't know about this. I don't know if I like where this is going. Like, this seems really, really dangerous that we're just going to approve of everybody and start affirming everybody. Then you need to know this week is the most important week of the series for you, because your tendency is to jump straight into correcting people. And the Apostle Paul is clear. You cannot do that. You cannot jump into correcting people until you have first proven that you actually care for people. And so let's dig into the text and what he actually said. Let me ask you a question. Was the Apostle Paul a man? Yes, not a trick question, okay? Everybody could have got that one right, okay? Yes, the Apostle Paul was a man, okay? But Paul does not live exclusively out of the father figure role. And so if you're a man, if you're a father, I need you to hear me say this. You cannot live your life going, well, it's my job as dad to correct everyone, and it's her job to care for everyone. And so that's just the way we're going to operate as a family. The Apostle Paul, who was very much a man, says about himself, says about another guy named Silvanus and another guy named Timothy. He said, all of us, we were like a mother who cared for you. Before he ever corrected them, he first cared for them. Specifically, he said it like this. He said, like a nursing mother who cares for her children. That is how we cared for you. Now, if you've ever been a nursing mother, hats off to you. You are an amazing individual who has given and given and given until there was nothing left to give. In fact, you probably understand this analogy or this imagery that Paul is using far better than I do. So I was talking to Jacob and Molly. Jacob's on our staff team, and they just had their first baby not all that long ago, okay? In fact, if you haven't seen their baby, we got a picture. We're going to throw it up on the side screen for you. This is little baby Levi, okay? I was talking to them, and I said, man, I have seen a lot of ugly babies in my life, okay? This is one of the most beautiful babies I've ever seen in my life. And I told him, I said, Jacob, if you can keep popping them out like that, you need to like keep going, like have 5 or 10, like maybe just have 12 and just have all the disciples like Jesus did, and then use those guys to change the world. But Levi is a very beautiful baby, okay? And so as you might guess, little Levi is waking up in the middle of the night because he's hungry, maybe even hangry, okay? So like he's like, I want something to eat. Well, when Levi wakes up and Jacob always gets a little bit startled when the baby wakes up. And so he goes, Molly, is there anything I can do to help? Okay? And so Molly looks at him and says, not unless you got milk in those puppies, like you're kind of useless to me in this situation, okay? And so Jacob just like, okay, sorry, I can't help. And, she gets up and she goes to care for the baby. And you and I both know that Molly right now is carrying a burden, okay? In fact, she is caring for that child like 24/7. But we all know that through the course of breastfeeding and that experience that a mother has, that they're not just carrying a burden, but they're also creating a bond. This is so important if you're going to understand what Paul's saying. They're creating an incredible bond with one another through this experience. In fact, researchers say that there are all kinds of things that children learn through the breastfeeding experience. They learn that their mother is there to care for them in a way that no one else does. They learn through the breastfeeding experience that their mother is there to comfort them in a very unique and special way. And so as she holds the baby close to her chest, that baby feels the warmth of the mother's skin. She can hear the soothing sound of the heartbeat through the mother's chest. That child feels very comforted by the mother, so much so that much later in life, it still affects them. What do children do when they need comfort? Do they run to mom or do they run to dad? Please tell me mom, because if not, that says something terrible about me as a father. Because my kids always run to their mama when they want to be comforted, okay? And I think they learn this, researchers say, from the earliest stages of this breastfeeding experience. So they are cared for and they are comforted by their mama, and then they also learn to trust their mother, okay? Now, listen to this one article that I read this week. It said this: through research and women's personal experience, it has been shown that the bond, again, very important word here, the bond between a mother and a baby strengthens with breastfeeding. Scientists have often wondered what exactly happens between a mom and a baby that creates this unique bond. According to the Child Development Institute, breastfeeding is designed to ensure maternal-infant interaction and closeness, and if done without schedules or restrictions, the mother quickly learns to read her baby's cues and to trust her own instincts. In saying that, breastfeeding allows a trust to be established between the pair. And this is the analogy that Paul is using to teach us what it looks like to care for other people. To care for your spouse, to care for your children, to care for your neighbors, to care for your coworkers or your friends. In order to get this right, in order to be for them, you've got to create a bond with them. And so I need you to understand this. Before you can ever correct someone, you have to care for them in a way that creates a bond with them. And so this bond gets established in the way that you care for people, in the way that you comfort people, in the way that people in your life learn that they can trust you. And again, it doesn't matter who it is in your life. This is the kind of bond that we're working to create. And it happens when we understand that caring always comes before correcting. And when we don't get this right, it leads people in our lives and people in our world to think, you are against me, you are not really for me. And so let me ask you two questions. Have you taken the time to establish a bond? And has anything happened that caused the bond to be broken? And I really need you to think about that. I really need you to think about the possibility that maybe something has happened that has caused the bond to be broken. You know this, but I need you to think about this. Rules without relationship leads to rebellion. If you don't know that, you need to write that one down. Rules, if you're trying to enforce rules with your kids and you don't have a strong relationship with your kids, it's going to lead to an absolute rebellion. Or we might say it this way today: correcting without caring always leads to conflict. And so if you are trying to correct and it's always leading to conflict, then you need to take a step back and you need to say, I got to start caring more and I've got to start correcting less. See, when you go into correcting mode, here's the way you think. You think, well, I know my intentions are good. I know that I love them. I know that I am just for them, and I only want what is best for them. And that's the way that you feel. But that may not be the way that they feel. Why? Because the bond hasn't been established, or something has happened that caused the bond to be broken. And so you have to get into that mode of saying, I'm going to care for them more, and I'm going to spend a lot less time trying to correct them. And listen, you need to know this. The bond may have been broken, and you don't even realize that it's been broken. I have broken the bond with my family members before, and I didn't even realize I broke it. I've broken a bond with staff members before, and I didn't even realize that I had broken the bond. And so when you try to correct someone without caring for them, you're going to experience all kinds of conflict. And so you've got to take that step back, and you've got to get out of correcting mode, and you've got to get into caring mode, like the Apostle Paul did. He started acting as a mother who cares for the children before he ever acted like a father who was trying to correct the children. Now, Paul goes on and he elaborates on this analogy a little bit more in verse 8. This is what he said. He said, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of our God, but our very lives as well. Okay? So the problem for us is we jump into father mode, which is next week, and we bypass mother mode, which is this week. And when we do that, what happens is it comes across as though we're sharing our message with them because you're frustrated with me and you're trying to fix me. Or they hear it like this: you don't like me, and so you're sharing your message to try to change me. And this is why so many people feel like their parents, they feel like their spouse, they feel like the Christian community is somehow against them. The Apostle Paul said, I worked really hard to make sure that those in Thessalonica knew that I was for them. I wasn't against them. And one of the ways he did that is, yes, he shared his message with them, but he also shared his very life with them. Now, why is it so important for us to share our lives with people, not just our message, or not just the message of Christianity with people? Because people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. We've all heard that phrase to the point that it almost comes across as though it's a little cheesy these days. But that's what Paul is saying. Paul's language, he said, man, we loved you so much that yes, we shared the message, but we also shared our very lives. Listen, you need to know something about people, whether it's your kids, your spouse, whether it's someone who's just a friend or a family member or a coworker. You need to know that people are not looking for someone to tell them what to do. They are looking for someone who can show them what to do. And so this is why Paul said, we didn't just share the message, we shared our very lives. This is what Paul did for them in Thessalonica. And what happened is people heard this offer, and the offer to live in community was so much more attractive than the idea of living life completely and totally alone. And yet you just need to know something about people in the world today. They feel very much alone. People in the world today probably feel more alone than maybe they ever have before in human history. And when you feel alone and isolated, you start to feel overwhelmed. And it's only getting worse the more and more our world becomes digital. So former Surgeon General Vivek Murthy said it like this. He said, during my years caring for patients, the most common pathology I saw was not heart disease or diabetes. It was loneliness. People all around you are terribly lonely. In fact, studies are showing that as the world gets more and more digital, as you are spending more time on a screen and less time with people, the number of friends that you have in the last few years has been cut in half. It's just the reality of the world that we live in and the way in which we conduct ourselves, again, living on a screen rather than living in relationships. And so one of the problems is that people are very much doing life alone, but then that leads to another problem. And the other problem is that people end up looking for relationships in all the wrong places. You need to know they're not coming to the church. Why? because the church is against them. And so they end up going and looking for relationships, and relationships start to form that are unhealthy, maybe even toxic. Relationships are built around what are we against rather than what are we for. In fact, John Mark Comer, a pastor in Portland, said it this way. He said, relationships today are not built around a mutual love for things, but are built instead on mutual hate. Not on what we are for, but on what you are against. But if you are lonely and sad, and you don't know who you are, or you don't have an identity in Christ, then anti-community is probably better than no community. And so when the church is either unwilling or incapable of sharing both the gospel of our God, the message of Christianity, and our very lives with people, then we ultimately lead people with two really lousy choices or options. You can either live life alone because I don't want to spend time with you because we're nothing like one another. We don't think the same. We don't look the same. We don't act the same. We don't believe the same. So you can either do life by yourself, or you can jump into relationships that are unhealthy, toxic. You can jump into an anti-community where everything will revolve around what you are against rather than what you are for, where everything will revolve around what you hate rather than what you love. And that, my friends, is the world that we are living in today. These are not just some of the most divisive times in your lifetime. These are some of the most divisive times in American history. And the church has actually contributed to the problem rather than leading the way in solving the problem. Thankfully, we have a very healthy alternative when we look at the life of the Apostle Paul. A man who said, no, I'm not just sharing my message with you. We're going to share life together to the point that people who are nothing like you should actually want to spend time with you because they know that you are for them, not against them. And so as we wrap it up today, I just want to ask you this question. Do the people in your life feel like you care about them, or do they feel like you are only interested in correcting them? I want you to think about it. I want you to think about specific people in your life, your spouse, your kids, people that you work with, and your neighbors. Do they feel like you really care for them, or that you're only interested in correcting them? While you think about it, I want to read something that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 through 3. He said, "And yet I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I come across as really annoying. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." And so I really want you to understand what Paul is saying. He says you can speak to people, you can try to teach people, you can try to correct people, you can even get fancy and try to prophesy to people, you can even make all kinds of sacrifices for people. But without love, Paul says, I accomplished nothing, I am nothing, and I gain nothing. And this is why Andy Stanley says that so many Christians in the world today are great at making a point, but they're terrible at making a difference. Guys, let's be for people. But before we ever try to correct them, we first have to make sure that we have cared for them in a way that makes them feel comforted, in a way that makes them feel cared for, and in a way that makes them feel like they can truly trust us. Will you pray with me? God, we sit here as a group of people who are followers of Jesus, and we have to confess that sometimes we don't follow him very well. And so, God, I just pray that you would take these seeds that are being planted in your people, and I pray that there would be a radical change that takes place in us. I pray, God, that we would stop being against people. Help us to start being for people. Help us to make sure that people know that we do love them, that we do care about them, that we're not trying to fix them, we're not frustrated with them, we're not trying to change them because we don't like them. That's not even our job. That's the job of the Holy Spirit of God. And so, God, just help us to think about how important this is and help us to get it right. Help us to think about the words that we say and the way we come across, the way that we're perceived by everyone in our lives. God, we just invite your Spirit to convict us of right and wrong, to help us to see ourselves in a whole new light so that we can be more like Jesus. We ask it all in his name. Amen.